Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, critical thinker at large, coming at you for another podcasting greatness hour or two. We'll see. We'll see how this goes. Now, I am joined this week by a guest. Her name is I always butcher people's names, and I didn't even check with you before. I'm so horrible. Jen Kiaba.
That was perfect.
Yes. Yeah. I got it right the first time. My audience will know. This is rare. Okay, so I am welcoming Jen Kiaba. Now, she is a former member, grew up in the Unification Church, the Moonies, the same group that Steve Hassan, who I think most of you who are watching or listening to the show are familiar with. Same group he was involved in the 1970s. This is the organization of Reverend Sun Myung Soon, something like that.
Moon. That's where you get Moonies.
Moonies, yes, that's right. And anyway, welcome to the show, Jen.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you.
Yeah, I think this is going to be fun. And you are the first guest I've had who is doing the same educational program that I am, the Psychology of Coercive Control program through the University of Salford. How's that going for you?
Amazing. It's 6 weeks in, and I feel like I am drowning in research methods. Maybe...
We should talk after the show.
I know. This is something that I've actually talked to the heads of the program about, and I think it's something that they're familiar with, that a lot of people who've grown up in these high demand groups, our education is very spotty, and that's a nice way of putting it. So I come to this program with a deep interest in the subject matter, but maybe with a weakness in the science. And so there's a lot of catch up that I feel like I'm doing. And so I love it. And it is, it's like a roller coaster ride for me emotionally, because SGAs tend to be perfectionists. We're super hard on ourselves. And so it's like, oh my God, I suck. I am coming in with a little bit of a handicap,
I hear you. I hear every word you are saying. And a year ago, yes. I get it. I will throw out there for you right now, in case we don't get a chance later. The greatcourses.com class on statistics was quite helpful for me.
Yeah, I have it queued up in my library rentals.
There you go. That's what got me through as far as the statistics part of it. And that was the toughest part, was was figuring out p-values and stuff like that. I was totally lost. Lost.
Yeah, we were reading, we were doing a reading and then like a group analysis of studies that were all quantitative. And I was just like, it's another language.
Yeah, so, it really is. Yeah. It really is. And diving in, are you coming at this after doing 4 years, or did you jump the line like I did and just go right to the master's program?
No, I did 4 years. I got out of the Unification Church when I was 21 and was a little bit, again, spotty. So just, in my primary school years and high school years, I went to, I think, 12 different schools in 13 years. And had some homeschooling, which was basically my parents leaving me with a set of encyclopedias and saying, read. So, I struggled through a 4-year, worked my way through it in terms of trying to keep a roof over my head, get enough food to eat. And I had a car where literally the bottom of it was falling off on the road. So yeah, like classic SGA trying to survive in the real world. But I did come out with a 4-year degree and a shit ton of debt. So it took me 10 years before I thought I was ready to approach a master's.
Awesome. Well, good on you for doing that and for doing what you're doing now. There's a lot of backstory here. Excuse me. And we have, my audience is, I'm gonna speak for my audience right now and say that, you guys out there who've been watching this show for a long time are familiar with a lot of the concepts and terminology that we have been, that Jen and I are now learning or studying about in this coercive control program, because we have been covering not only the subject of destructive cults, but also human trafficking and domestic violence. And it's interesting, actually, listening to your story, in earlier interviews you've done, seeing the connections between how these various domains of coercive control actually connect in your story, in your life, and how one actually kind of begets another, kind of begets another.
Yeah.
You know, especially in the case of the context of your parents, you know, who were, well, I'll let you tell the story. So why don't we go ahead and get to that? What is the, as far as the broad strokes, what are the broad strokes of your story?
Sure. Yeah. So being a second generation means that, you know, my parents joined the Unification Church, both very young. My father was 18. I think my mother was 20. They both came out of family environments or personal circumstances that I think the broad public would associate with the cult recruit. You know, you and I and your audience probably know that there is no single personality type that lends itself to cult recruitment. However, my parents fit that kind of classic paradigm. Not of a stupid person necessarily or a gullible person, but certainly someone who is carrying a lot of trauma. So my mother had recently lost her fiance in a tragic accident. My father grew up without a father. He lost his father to cancer at like 11, had a very sort of distant mother. And I think both of them were looking for something. They were both seekers with a lot of damage. So they were both trafficked through the Unification Church mobile fundraising team. The kind of classic way that people were indoctrinated in the Unification Church is that, you know, they were met by a front group, and whomever met this person would model like, oh yeah, all these things that you're interested in, we do that through the, you know, creative community project or whatever. And they'd be invited to a dinner or an evening and then taken to a camp, and then they'd go through classic thought reform processes. So after that, you know, if you've read Lifton, you know that thought reform doesn't necessarily hold unless you stay in that milieu, right? And so I believe that mobile fundraising team, which is the classic human trafficking of the Unification Church, it's people literally live in vans and are carted around the country selling flowers and trinkets. And the classic image of the Moonie in the 1970s is somebody selling flowers at the airport. In fact, the movie Airport shows the scene where like the Moonie gets punched in the face. Hilarious, but also really sad because that's a trafficked person we're thinking about. That's become a punchline. So anyway, I think that's the environment in which that sort of pseudo/cult personality hardens. And so my parents were probably both in the church for 5+ years before they were matched by Reverend Moon in 1979. And then they were married in the mass wedding in 1982, which most Americans remember. It's the Madison Square Garden blessing. So,
and blessing meaning marriage.
Marriage, yeah. And so the theological kind of idea behind the blessing is that, oh, see, one of my cats is already here demanding something. I knew this was going to happen. The blessing is in Reverend Moon's ideology to basically remove a person from Satan's lineage. And we can go into this later, but there's a lot of like sexual ideology and sexual ritual historically that feeds into that. But
yeah, you'd mentioned, if I might cut you off for just a moment, just because it surprised the hell out of me. I didn't know this, and I don't claim any expertise on the Moonies, but I'm somewhat familiar through Hassan's story and other things that I've read. But I was not aware the man was, you know, back in Korea, had been sleeping around, had, you know, very loose sexual morality, and then comes to America and completely flips the script. And it's all about sexual repression and oppression.
Classic control, right? Sexual repression and oppression. I don't know exactly what the thought process was in terms of the switch, other than maybe they realized that having orgies wasn't going to be great for recruitment in the United States. Like there must have been a market mismatch somewhere.
I tell you, because it seems to me it would be a fairly viable recruitment line, you know, but apparently not.
Yeah. Yeah, so to kind of flesh out what you're saying, in Korea in the 1950s, there were a number of shamanistic groups that were popping up. And,
Mhm.
in shamanism and paganism, sexual rituals are a very common thing. And so I try to be very careful about condemning that when I talk about the Unification Church. But there is a history of group sex and ritual sex as sort of a cleansing to, again, remove somebody from the lineage of Satan and bring them into what Moon believed was like the godly lineage. And so he was the purifier of the womb, so he had to have sex with all the ladies, and then the ladies could go and have sex with the men.
Right.
And so that, because it didn't get imported exactly into the United States, it is still retained in Unification Church theology through the 3-day ceremony, which all first generation have to do. Creeps me out to think about my parents doing it, because it's 3 days of ritual sex. Oh, hello, sweetie, in front of Moon's picture.
Wow.
And there are like handkerchiefs that you save from it. Sorry,
My goodness.
this is the most disruptive that she's been in a while.
No worries. I wasn't aware that there was this much specific sexually oriented dogmatic activity going on in this group. And I wasn't speaking, by the way, just to clarify for you and for the audience, I wasn't speaking to condemn behavior one way or the other, except to point out the cultural context switches the belief set in sometimes, fantastic 180-degree ways.
Right.
And I find that fascinating that they can get away with that kind of thing,
I think that they repress the history of the sexual ritual even within the Unification Church. So it's something that's talked about of like, did it happen? Did it not happen? The older couples who would have participated in it are probably very hush-hush about it. There is a book called The Change of Blood Lineage Through Ritual Sex. I think that's the name of it. I'll give you the title of it later if you want to put in the show notes, but it is an exploration of that particular history of the Unification Church. But growing up, I didn't know anything about it. And if and when people talked about it, it was like, no, that didn't happen. That's just Satan accusing Moon, true father is what we called him. And my mother would put it in terms of like, in Korea, Satan accused father of the one thing that he knew that the Korean people would condemn, which was sexual immorality. And then when he came to the United States, Satan switched tactics and said that in America he was, brainwashing. So it was always Satan and Satan's chess game with providence and God's providence.
Got it.
There's, there are a lot of different ways that I think people justified it to themselves without believing that it was true, even when there was specific evidence.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That makes complete sense and is completely consistent with, cognitive dissonance theory and everything we know about that. That people, here's the funny thing. And I was thinking about, I thought of another way to explain this. Let me know what you think about this, because I throw these things out every now and again. And this one being, people ask how you'd have to be a moron to join a cult. You'd have to be a stupid person to join a cult. You hear this over and over and over again. We're just it becomes like a litany that that certain people out there just kind of have this thing that they think the intelligence is going to protect you from this, and it just doesn't work that way. It's not a shield in any way. But my take on it is that the belief is so powerful that it's not you're stupid and then you adopt this belief. It's that you adopt this belief and it's so overpowering to your life and you make it that way that you kind of keep yourself stupid. It's the other way around,
I think that at some point, when your milieu, when your personality sort of ossifies within the group context, that is absolutely true. I would say that that's probably, I think it's more of a fight as a person is going through that indoctrination process. And I'm sure there's a lot of flipping back and forth, the snapping, as it's called.
That's right.
So I always roll my eyes when I hear people say only stupid people join cults. I would never be that stupid, because again, A, nobody joins. B, nobody is, Janja Lalich in Take Back Your Life has that contract that, like, if you were offered this contract by a cult that told you this is what your life will be, this is exactly what we're going to do to you, would you sign it? And everybody's like, of course not. But that's not how people are approached. And it's a very gradual thing, and it's filled with a lot of deception. So we've all been deceived. I've bought things on infomercials when I've been in hotels at 2 a.m.
Right.
Like, I think we've all done that at some point, right?
Yeah.
So that means that we are susceptible to some form of influence. And it's just a matter of how much we are subjected to and the amount of time and our personal circumstances too, because, there are specific points at which we are all vulnerable. So
exactly.
Yeah.
I make this point constantly, and I love it when my guests make that point too.
It's one that I feel like I sort of say until I'm blue in the face when I talk to people. But I think it's probably one of the most important things is that we are all vulnerable. And once we accept that, then we can start looking out for the signs. We can start educating ourselves and each other.
Exactly. All right. Well, I completely cut you off there. So Please pick back up on your broad strokes narrative here. Yes.
So that's how I got here is, probably a creepy sex ritual, just, history. Everybody loves thinking about that. Yeah, so I'm the oldest of 5 kids, and in the Unification Church, the second generation are referred to as blessed children because the kind of core theology is that the fall of man was a sexual sin between Eve and Lucifer, who, seduced Eve, and then Eve seduced Adam. And so through this sexual congress, all of humanity became engrafted onto Satan's lineage instead of God's lineage. And so through the sexual rites within the Unification Church, whether the group sex of the 1950s or the sort of more family-friendly portable version of the 3-day ceremony in the United States, we are engrafted back onto God's lineage. And so second generation were the people that, God had been waiting for through 6,000 years of biblical history.
We were just waiting for Reverend Moon to come along so he could purify the whole line.
Well, so a little more of the mythology is that, Reverend Moon believed that at like 15 or 16, depending on the Korean way of counting or the American way of counting, Jesus appeared to him at Easter while he was praying on a mountain and said, I wasn't supposed to die on the cross. You need to fulfill my mission for me. My mission was to get married and make babies. Continue God's lineage.
So he got away with rewriting the entire fundamental principle of Christianity. Mm-hmm. And all these people are on board with that.
Oh, yeah. And I think...
wow.
Yeah. Some people really believed that, like, this makes sense. There's a lecture in the Unification Church theology called like the Parallels of History. And it was not invented by Moon. None of the theology was. He sort of cherry picked a lot of different things, but it's supposed to show how through biblical history, all of these figures came. And it's supposed to be very scientific and mathematical to show that, the Messiah was supposed to be born in Korea, was supposed to be born in 1920. So that by the end of like a 7-day workshop, when someone was being indoctrinated, nobody had to tell them Reverend Moon is the Messiah. They had the spiritual revelation themselves.
Right.
And so I think that through that indoctrination process, even people who, I would think that somebody who was like a really staunch Christian who had a good grounding in theology would probably have been able to argue with the lectures and then gotten kicked out of the indoctrination workshops.
Yeah.
But anybody who is like vaguely Christian, who hadn't really read the Bible to that depth, might have been able to say like, oh, that makes sense. Right. So I find it really funny to, sidetrack again that the evangelical right in the United States has kind of cozied up with the Moon factions, because there are now factions now that Reverend Moon has died. And so they look at these as sort of like these neo-Christian groups, you know, the main branch of the church, and then Sean Moon's AR-15 group that has been in the news lately. And it's like, if you really peek under the hood, this is not a Christian organization. That, you know, they're basically saying Jesus failed. That is like the core tenet of Christianity. Sorry, guys, you actually weren't saved.
I mean, basically, that's why I am shocked that there are, you know, formal Christian organizations that are cozying up or allying with this outfit, because I can't think of anything more anti-Christian than that messaging. He literally says Jesus failed and I'm here because I'm the actual Messiah. And this, wow.
Yeah, I think there was this caveat of like, Jesus provides like physical salvation, but not spiritual salvation. Like, you basically can't get into heaven if you don't believe in Reverend Moon and you don't go through the blessing.
Right.
And so Jesus was sort of condemned to paradise, but not heaven.
I wonder how many failed, maybe failed is the wrong word. I wonder how many people, though, as you mentioned, people who come in really not well grounded in the Christian theology, really not, you know, well familiar, or I'm wondering how many of those people also might be coming to Moon or Moon's theology as a rejection of Christianity because maybe they grew up in a traumatized household, or you know, other negative indoctrination or negative repercussions from their religious belief. I'm not suggesting religious belief itself is you know, somehow damaging, but we know for a fact that there are a lot of households that are religious in nature that bring up kids in very abusive ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that recognizing that religious and spiritual abuse, religious trauma exist is very important. But as you know, getting an accurate sampling of the psychological state of current members is very difficult.
Yeah, they're not transparent, are they?
No. So yeah, no. And so I'm deep in Lifton's thought reform book right now, revisiting that. And it's so amazing to me to read about these experiments, because I think that's really what they were in terms of like human experiments on a psyche and psychology. The actual processes that they put people through in terms of condemning their past lives and condemning their associates and being struggled, you know, that was directly imported into the Unification Church indoctrination programs. If you read Moonwebs by journalist Josh Freed, it's out of print, but you can find it on like Amazon and thrift books and stuff. If you compare what he and his friend experienced in the Boonville camp, being indoctrinated into the Unification Church, it's eerily resonant of what people experienced in China, maybe more in like the university setting versus the prison settings, but it's still, that framework is the same.
Yep.
And so that does make it really, really hard when you're talking to somebody, again, whose personality has sort of calcified within the indoctrination, to get a true sense of what their past was, because they've been so, learned to condemn their past. And so you might actually get data that says like, yeah, my past was so abusive and my parents were so terrible and I was this drug addict, or my her classic line was like, if I hadn't been saved by Father, I would have ended up dead from drugs or something like that. Like, I think that she smoked pot. Right. Maybe did some acid. Maybe it was the 70s, right?
Right.
But I look back on like the little bits of the story that I get and the pieces that I'd gotten from like my uncle and stuff. I'm like, you don't sound like the type, Ma, but that, you know, she was convinced of that storyline because, again, she went through this thought reform process that taught her that she had to reject that past life, you know, and she had to completely condemn it. So again, just going back to the data would be completely dirty, in my opinion.
Yeah. Oh, no, for sure. For sure. I just like throwing out, you know, random research questions because it's fun.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I wonder how many of those were, fill in the blank, right? Or
Right.
because these are completely legit research questions. Actually, I mean, these are very, very needed things to questions to have answers to. But we don't. But the problem in studying these, whether you're coming at it from a psychological, sociological, or religious studies perspective, is none of these groups are readily open or transparent about their activities, membership, attitudes, or even their teachings. So
It,
makes it a little hard to study.
It does. It does. And I finished Singer's Cults in Our Midst, which is part of our reading list. And she throws some serious shade on not only the cult groups, but then the researchers who try to like work with the cults, right? And she specifically calls out Dr. Eileen Barker for Making of a Moonie because she did get unprecedented access to members of the Unification Church to make that book. However, she was paid by the Unification Church to do it, so she lost funding for her charity called Inform. But more importantly, is that the Unification Church and other groups, which Singer again calls out, they're going to cherry pick the people that researchers get to talk to. You're not going to get the person that's going through a psychotic episode because they've been so abused by the group. They're going to pick the people that come across as like the most normal, if you will. And so again, like, how do you get an accurate data sampling of the people who are in? And this, this kind of goes into like that whole core argument of the cult wars, right? Between the cult sympathizers and the anti-cultists generally being more on the psychology and psychiatric side, being like, look, these are the people that have come out of these groups. They are severely damaged. And then the people who are more like sociologists and new religious movement scholars talking to the people that the cult has given them access to, being like, we're not getting that data. Like, what's going on? And so that's where a big rift comes in the data. And it is very frustrating. And I think that it's informed a big problem in the communication that we have today about who joins the cult, what is a cult, so that, yeah.
You're nailing
go
it.
Down there.
You are describing the exact problem. And I have recently actually done a whole podcast on exactly what you were just talking about. Because that problem has become more and more apparent to me recently with more articles from NRM-minded sociologists and religious studies scholars that I've been responding to. I've actually been writing written responses to, not publishing them in academic journals, but in popular media. I've been responding openly to these academics. And
that's awesome.
Yeah, it's basically declaration of war, but the cult wars is already going, so it's really just lobbing more missiles. But it's the next generation of it, because this has been going on since the 70s when Brian R. Wilson got this whole thing going. And it's not just a pro and an against. My issue with this is, I'm willing to see that there are people who are going to be sympathetic to certain aspects of the cults and what they're doing. From a religious studies perspective of looking at them as baby religions and aren't they cute and they go through these tough periods and when you get really ivory tower and really step away from the atrocities of it, I get how some people can get in that frame of mind. It's naive, but I get it. What I don't get is how any of them get off completely writing off everything you and I have to say about our experiences.
Yeah, I am not fully aware of too many people in the new religious movement camp other than Dr. Eileen Barker who have tried to really listen to maybe the second generation standpoint. She did come to a panel that I was presenting on for an ICSA workshop. But at the same time, and I don't want to come across as sympathetic because I do see myself more in the anti-cult camp because I did experience this from birth. But when you look back at the history to the 1970s where parents were creating these conservatorships and there were these deprogrammings and kidnappings, I can understand how somebody from an academic standpoint, from a legal standpoint, from a sociological standpoint would be like, hold the fucking phone here. This is a basic violation of these people's human rights.
You're talking about deprogramming now.
Deprogramming, the conservatorships that were happening. Like if you read Betty Underwood's book, Hostage to Heaven, she is one of 5 Unification Church members that were held under a temporary conservatorship by their parents, trying to get them out of the Unification Church. And then I think all of them subsequently went through deprogramming, maybe not to the extent Betty might have been like kidnapped too. So these things kind of came hand in hand.
Yeah.
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 And I mean, I grew up hearing stories that, again, may have been hyperbole, and we can get back to my story eventually, but this is way more interesting to me. I grew up hearing stories about people like Ted Patrick as being the boogeyman. Like I went to a church boarding school for 1 year, and most of the time my science teacher talked about his deprogramming. I don't really remember anything about science, but I remember him talking about being locked in a hotel room tied to a bed. And that people were taught to like slit their wrists to be sent to the hospital. In fact, I think it's in one of the first gen memoirs that I have where, no, it's in a book called Brainwash by Dominic Stridfield, where he talks about, I forget her name. She wasn't deprogrammed by Ted Patrick, but somebody Green. And now,
not familiar with Green.
He's a lawyer in California, and I'm blanking on his first name, but there was a brother and sister. They both joined the church. He joined. He came in looking for her to try to get her out. He got indoctrinated for like a year or two, left, and then he tried to kidnap his sister. He did kidnap his sister, and she like broke a bottle or something and like sliced herself too. I don't think it was her wrist. But anyway, point being that like these were the folk tales that I grew up with about deprogramming,
right.
And just how horrifying and scarring for my parents' generation it was. So again, this is not to defend the new religious movement side of things, because I also recognize that there are horrible atrocities and abuses that are committed by these new religious movements. And why are you giving them a pass because they're baby religions? And I really, really hate the, cult plus time equals religion equation.
Right.
Because it's like, I don't know about that. We don't have the data to really say whether or not like Christianity in its inception was as abusive as some of these other groups that you and I come from. We just don't know. So that's speculative at best.
Well, it is. And there's a lot, there are deep conversations to be had about that particular theory or framing, or however you want to kind of look at it. The evolutionary process of religions is a fascinating study. And it's one that I've said many, many times needs to be studied. I would love to see, objective academic work done on that. Now, I'll send you after the show, by the way, this paper that was written by Stephen Kent, which clearly lays out the history of where this apostates should not be listened to. Apostates are to be ignored, and I mean ignored. It's a black and white issue for them. It is straight up. They have nothing to contribute to the conversation. They are not to be listened to. Every single one of them, by the way, and this is Brian R. Wilson, this is 1970s, and this actually predates the entire deprogramming fiasco, which was absolutely horrible and only fed them ammunition, but it wasn't actually the genesis point of not listening to apostates or not listening to former members, as they call us apostates. I actually kind of hate that word, but
it's a very JW phrase, isn't it? It's not one the Unification uses, Unification Church. It's like ex-members, former members.
Yeah, see, Scientology grabbed onto the apostates thing.
Okay.
They actually couldn't cater to Brian R. Wilson enough back in the 70s and 80s. And I actually just yesterday spoke with a former high-level church official who's now out in Scientology, who talked all about whining and dining Brian Wilson for Scientology, specifically so he would write these papers and so that former Scientologists would never be listened to by academia, and it worked.
Well,
You
I
know?
am sure that there's dirty Unification Church money mixed in there
Yeah.
too, then.
That's right.
I'll
That's
do
right.
some Googling.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and one that I am into because I believe that it's almost a matter of I some people might think that this is a bit hyperbolic to put it this way, but I truly believe it's a human rights issue. I mean, if an entire class of people are being relegated to the trash heap, and they are, by an entire school of academia, I think this is a gigantic problem.
Yeah.
And that has been the dogmatic approach of religious studies and sociology, that not psychology. And this is why we have this thing called the cult wars, you know, and it's this horrible decades long nonsense that I'd love to help bury the hatchet. Actually, I don't want to continue this. I want to work with these people, but man, they make it tough. You know?
Yeah, I did try to go to Inform put on a conference recently about just even using the term cult and things like that. And I dipped out pretty quickly. I don't remember who the first person was that was talking, but I was having such an emotional reaction to it because, again, it did feel like it was taking my experience, your experience, everybody like us, and just completely saying that it was just invalidating us. And I was like, no, can't handle that.
That's right. That's
and
right.
Inform published a book called The Cult Wars in Perspective. And I was like, oh, if I could find it cheap enough, I would buy it to like scribble my anger in the margins.
Yes.
But it's very expensive. So
Yes, and that's exactly the kind of thing that in the future, once I finish this program, because I'm on the thesis part now, once I get done with this thing, I'm very seriously considering how I can publish, you know, in not, they won't publish my stuff at Cessna or in Inform, but I am going to figure out ways to fight back against this because it's just time. It needs to change. And there is some indication of sea change with this, but it's not fast enough and there's still too many of them and too few of us. And that needs to, and actually what I say that, I mean, in academia, because in the real world, there's way more ex-members of these destructive cults than there are this small number of academics that we're talking about, but they dominate the field. And so, you know, it's just not fair.
right.
Yeah. So, and as you pointed out, actually, and see, this is so funny because we didn't talk about this part at all. This has been a whole tear I've been on for weeks now. We didn't talk about this at all. I didn't know this was even going to come up in us talking about this, you know, but clearly my point that these academics kind of re-traumatize us with this.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. There was a big conversation in a group that I'm involved with. It's a survivors advocacy group, and there's a kind of I think pop psychology is like too generous of a phrase, but it's about cults that just came out. And it does quote one of these new religious movement scholars, and there are things in it that I don't think the broad audience of the book are necessarily going to pick up on, but because I'm so hypersensitive to this topic, I had to put the book in my attic when I was done with it because I was pissed, you know. And I really held back. A lot of times when I like a book, I will email an author and kind of geek out at them, and I wanted to kind of yell at this author and be like, "Yo, you are doing a huge disservice to survivors, even as you try to educate the public." And that impetus is still there, but I'm holding back.
Yeah, I hear you. I know exactly what you're talking about. And my response to that is I'm just my plan is to just outpublish these people in terms of, you know, either popular literature and or academic literature, you know, both ways. I want to just I want to finish this. It's time that this gets done and that we get listened to. And only so a fully objective and balanced approach can be brought to this field. It's not about my side winning, you know, and they're all cults and they're all horrible and we should drive them all into the dirt. You know, that's not really my attitude. I think reform is possible. I think public education is possible. I think there's a lot of things possible in the future with this.
Yeah.
But not if we can't even agree that there is a problem here. And that's the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for survivors, the fact that there are people that say there is no problem is sort of, again, you said re-traumatization, and I'm thinking it's like a gaslighting of we're going through the same thing where we're like, wait a minute, I grew up thinking there was a problem. You told me that there isn't. I get out and I'm like, hey guys, this is a problem. And you're like, no, it's fine. It's like,
Exactly. And I find it sadly funny that they lament constantly, these NRM academics lament constantly about how the media misportrays these cults because they rely on our stories. And it's like, I just wish you wouldn't display your bias so openly. You know?
This is a hard one for me because I will share more in depth off the record with you about this, but there are certain survivor stories that I have heard that are very prominent. And I'm like, that doesn't jive with my understanding of the group. And I really struggle with this because on one hand, I totally recognize that the experience within a single group is non-homogeneous, right? Mm-hmm. But when somebody talks about how they felt as though they were like trained to kill by Reverend Moon, I'm like, really? and then at the same time, I'm like, but actually, I grew up reciting a pledge. I seem to remember my family being super fundamentalist, and we did this every day for morning service, but it was supposed to be on Sundays and holy days. And this pledge was like, I will charge into the enemy camps and judge them with the weapons that God has been judging Satan for the last 6,000 years. I will fight with my life. This I pledge and swear. I was fucking 4 years old saying this in English and Korean, at least weekly, probably daily, because again, my parents were a little off the deep end there. So then I think about that and I'm like, would I have been indoctrinated enough to kill somebody? And certainly if I was in, let's say again, that like mobile fundraising unit kind of milieu where I wasn't sleeping more than 4 hours a day and I was on the road every day and chanting to myself to try to kind of keep evil spirit rolled out and stuff, like all of these things that, you know, create dissociation and whatnot, maybe.
Exactly.
So it's like, I have to fight that bias in myself. And I think that that's really important for a lot of us because we do a disservice to our community when we doubt each other's stories. And I find myself doing that sometimes when I hear even second generation stories where they're like, I was sent to Chungpyeong, which is this resort town in Korea where they do like super intense indoctrinations in the Unification Church. And the horror stories that I have heard are so extreme that I'll be like, wait, really? Are you sure? And I think that this is the same thing that we do to like rape survivors, for example, where we are so trained to doubt them and be like, they're lying. They're just trying to get attention. I have found that tendency in my own brain. And so it is so important to educate ourselves and each other to understand the depth to which these abuses are allowed within these groups, because otherwise we can become a detriment to each other.
Exactly. You know? That's a great point you just made. It's very important to acknowledge that this is an area of nuance. The area of memory, of experience, of abuse, atrocities, trauma, these are very subjective experiences. You know, what is one person's fantasy is another person's abuse when you get into, you know, certain realms, certain areas, certain ways of expression.
Yes, but consent.
Well, that's the point. Exactly.
Yes.
And informed consent. Yes.
What is the fully given, knowledgeable, informed acquiescence or something like that? FGKIA is like the hashtag now.
Okay.
You know?
Well, there you go.
Yes.
That's what we want. And and you don't get that, as you mentioned earlier. You know, if they gave you a piece of paper that described exactly what your life would be like, you'd be like, there's no way I'm going to do this.
Right.
But that's called informed consent. And you know, and I'm not talking about, you know, these ridiculous legalese terms of service nonsense that you have to ply through. I mean, that's not informed consent either. It's a wall of text that fails to inform you, and you're consenting to things you don't even understand, because who's going to do that, right? And nobody does, and they know that.
Right. Well, I think too, so one of the things that we're kind of deep in right now in my first trimester in this school program is looking at some of the laws in the UK in terms of the Modern Slavery Act, which goes into like human trafficking, and then there's one about coercive control, and then there's another one about trafficking. But the one about coercive control, and then the one under the Modern Slavery Act, they struck me as important, and also maybe not going far enough to protect people like us. But at least in the Modern Slavery Act, when they talk about human trafficking, there's an understanding of what coercion is. Whereas in the United States, there is the phrase legal coercion. You know, so if somebody is afraid of being deported, you know, and you're using that fear to keep them in an enslavement position, that is illegal. But the coercion to get consent in a cultic environment, that doesn't look like it's strictly illegal.
Right.
And that's a huge problem to me. And I've just been sort of grinding my teeth about that because, again, my parents were trafficked, and we haven't gotten into my story much because, again, I don't think it's that interesting, but I was trafficked, you know, and the first time that I was trafficked, I was 12 years old. So I was, you know, brought around the city of Arizona to basically do campaigning for a member who is an assembly member in Arizona. He's now a judge, but he had 12 and 10-year-olds like going around doing the canvassing that fucking adults were doing recently. You know, he would drop us off for hours at a time.
Right. Yeah. This is not just, you know, some light volunteer work.
No,
done by some kids passing out flyers. This is not that.
No.
Because I want to be clear, when you use the word trafficking, you're talking about specific things. Just for the audience, you want to clarify what that is?
What trafficking is specifically?
Yeah, how you're referring to it here. Yeah, and talking about this.
So I'm specifically talking about labor trafficking. And so, you know, when my time and my efforts and my energies are being exploited for no pay, little pay, and there's no choice about it. And there's certainly no freely given informed consent or anything like that, because as a minor, you can't give that. And, you know, when I was 17, I lived in a van and fundraised for the church. So I was literally being moved across borders. I had no way of contacting anybody, no way of getting home. And I was in the streets all day selling trinkets, basically like cheap jewelry. A friend of mine was raped and murdered doing this. So that gives you an idea of how safe this was. I was alone, no cell phone, no mace, no personal alarm, hundreds of dollars on my person, and a minor. So the funny
recipe for disaster, anyone?
Yeah. And the really sad thing, and Elgin Strait, who runs the Falling Out podcast, when we were having a conversation about this, he pointed out that the most atrocious thing, beyond the fact that this program existed in the first place, was that it was allowed to continue after this girl was killed.
Yep.
You know, and the parents were pressured not to take their children off of this program because it was a huge cash cow, untraceable cash, millions of dollars for the Unification Church. But I think even more important than that, it was an indoctrination activity for second generation who had no conversion experience. So it was a perfect way to force indoctrination and break us so that we would have that conversion experience. So when I talk about labor trafficking, that's specifically what I'm honing in on. It sort of checks all the boxes.
Exactly. And I think that is a more complete description than what most people were thinking when you first said that. That's why I wanted you to elaborate on that, because
because volunteering for somebody's dad to go canvass a neighborhood for politics, it still sounds sort of like, well, that's a little cutesy, right? But then another time I was brought to this guy's house to take holy wine, dip a needle into it, and then pierce Tootsie Rolls. So, basically contaminating candy, and then taken to another city to hand out to unsuspecting tourists so that they would be blessed, and so you look at that and you're like, well, that's kind of creepy too. I don't know if that's trafficking necessarily when you do it to a 14-year-old, but those are the sorts of things that lay the foundation to then when you say, come on this sort of like a Mormon mission for 2 years, and you're going to have this great experience with God. When you've indoctrinated a young person with those kinds of activities their whole life, they're not going to look at this mobile fundraising team thing as like, that's creepy and fucked up, although some of us did. But they're going to look at that as sort of like more in the line of what was expected of them and what was normal. It completely normalized that activity for us.
Exactly. That is your normal. And that's the thing that I think so many people don't get about what the second gen experience is versus the first gen experience. It is so wildly different. It's almost two different paradigms. It's so different.
It is.
Because you have a person who willingly, knowingly, responsibly joins the group. In other words, responsibly meaning they are responsible to themselves. They did it.
Right. Yeah.
At the end of the day, they did it. Nobody necessarily kidnapped them into it or something. I wasn't kidding. My parents were not kidnapped into Scientology. They made their own decisions. I never was asked. You were never asked. We were never consulted. When you're born into it, this is your normal. This is your life. And if it is Xenu and volcanoes and space aliens, or if it is flowers and lighted candles or whatever at roadsides to sell, this is the normal experience of kids growing up in this stuff. This is how they think the world actually works.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was totally normal for kids to do like flower stands and stuff to raise money for activities, even for like church youth group stuff. And, somebody could say like, well, how is that different than doing a bake sale or Girl Scouts doing, cookie sales and stuff? But it's when you put that piece of the puzzle into the larger picture that it's hugely destructive.
Exactly. Because I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just going to say and when you layer in too, and I don't know if this was your experience in Scientology, but a lot of first gen's money went into the group, right? We weren't paying for classes. It was just like, here, take our money. Because there was always a new Providence or something that we had to donate to. So there wasn't a lot of money to actually care for the family, right? So if the kids needed anything, it was a huge problem financially. And so a lot of times these kids did take on that responsibility of like, well, I need to go fundraise to like buy clothes for school kind of stuff, or if like you wanted to go to a water park with your church youth group, it wasn't that the parents were like, yeah, let's do that. It's like, okay, we'll go raise the money to do it. So
exactly.
You're 12 years old, go get money.
Exactly. And let's keep in mind that these are kids who are generally not being raised on the same value sets or even going to public schools. You moved 13 times in 12 years. I mean, this is a mobile existence for a lot of these kids. So the stability, I guess psychologically what we're talking about is, major attachment issues. Right.
No.
I mean, just a couple. Because you got weird attachments with your family, with your school, with friends, if you have them and can keep them. You are leading a cloistered life. So the friends you can have are not just anybody you want to have friends with. Your parents have to filter your entire life experience through their belief set.
Yeah. And so, one of your questions earlier, I don't know if we hit it while we were recording, but certainly pre-chat, was about like what I'm learning in this program.
Yes.
And so one of the things, I mean, I've read Alexandra Stein's Terror, Love, and Brainwashing. So I'm very familiar with the various attachment styles that groups like this create. But what I didn't really realize until kind of reviewing Lifton again was that in the Unification Church, the parents were supposed to leave their children in these nurseries called Jacob's House, but they were really kind of like orphanages as soon as the child was 100 days old. And what that does is that disrupts the attachment of the infant majorly, right? And I know in the United States, we have horrible lack of paid leave and horrible support for families. So, a lot of us have to have 2-income households. And so 3 months, it's very normal for children to go into daycare. What's not normal is for them to never see their parents or to see their parents maybe on weekends. So I want to kind of clarify that. So as I'm reviewing Lifton, where he talks about in the thought reform programs, you have to basically call out your family as evil. What that does is that breaks down the familial ties so that your loyalty is to Mao, it's to the party, right? Well, the same thing happens in Unification Church when you leave an infant for a year, up to 7 years in some cases. What that does is that means that the children don't have attachment to their parents, the parents don't have attachment to their children, and everything goes up the hierarchy to Moon.
Yep.
So that's epically fucked.
Epically. That is a great description of that, because that's exactly what it is. And it also reinforces what you said earlier about how Moon seems to have just taken all the Chinese thought reform practices, because that's what Lifton studied. Lifton didn't invent this stuff. The Chinese did, and the Koreans did, and lots of other cultures through history have done this to people. This is not like it's impossible to figure out. People have done it for centuries. It's just Lifton kind of classified and clarified, and how does this work? And Moon, I think, took this methodology, let's say, wholesale, and then converted it into a religion.
So he was in North Korean prison camps. So this happened to him. And so I think what he did is, whether it was consciously or subconsciously, he was like, this is a really good idea, and he took it, and that became the model. But at the same time, I've said this to other people, SGAs who've grown up in different groups. It feels like all of these cult leaders have the same playbook, whether they're learning from each other or not. Like, they've all figured out this sort of secret recipe.
Yes. I just laugh because you're saying the exact same things I've been saying for years. So it's just hilarious to me to run into somebody else who so gets this, because that's exactly right. I've called it the exact same thing, cult leader playbook. I started saying that years ago, because because you realize it was actually an epiphany day for me. It was a real moment that to this day I remember of reading something. I was reading something about Jim Jones or Moon or some other cult leader. And it was almost word for word. I was reading what L. Ron Hubbard had been up to, or how he had described what he was doing. And it hit me. It just, oh, there's nothing. The reason it was cathartic was not, they're all the same. It was, there's nothing special about L. Ron Hubbard.
Yeah. I remember when I first got out listening to, what is it? First Day of My Life by Bright Eyes, the phrase, I'm happy just because I found out I'm really nobody. I know that that's dark, but at the same time, we were brought up to believe that we were so special. Yes. And this identity was so fraught because, everything that we did that wasn't on the straight and narrow broke God's already suffering heart and stuff like that. And when I digested the fact that, I'm just a normal person, I can lead a normal life, that was so freeing. But then on top of that, as I've gone to some of the second gen recovery workshops done by ICSA, talked to other SGAs, read Going Clear and other books like that, it is so helpful. Watching Seduced, which is one of the NXIVM documentaries, where they break it down. It's like, same thing happened to me, different words for the same thing. And I've actually used the phrase that I feel like we all speak dialects of the same language.
There you go. And the language is coercive control.
Yeah, it is.
Which is why this program is so awesome for us, because it really helps break down. And I hate this word, but it fits, as deconstruct,
I've co-opted that word from the ex-evangelical movement, so I don't hate it yet.
Yeah, it's got other connotations I hate, but
no. The whole, it's not Derrida or anything like that, if that's what you're referring to.
Oh, no.
I don't know.
I don't know what that is, but it's certain progressive circles. Okay. Yeah.
I could see how it could be applied to like more communist socialist thought in that regard.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. It gets a little weird sometimes, but it's a great word just as a word, because that's what you're doing. You're taking apart a construction. And that's what, and cult belief sets, these value sets are completely artificial constructions. They are the brainchild of one person, usually heavily modified as time goes on by contributions from others, usually unacknowledged, right? So that the leader can stay the leader, even though half the ideas really aren't even his or hers, as the case may be. And and there are just about 8 or 9 things they do. And it's really just a matter of the wording of how they convince you to do them, is kind of what it works out to.
So this is going to be kind of my grumpy aside here.
Yeah.
I had to refrain from writing a nasty email and getting into a Twitter war with somebody because a journalist recently wrote an article about the Unification Church and called it boring, like as far as cults go. And my reaction was originally like, fuck you, my trauma is not boring. Like it's this collective trauma. But on the other side of it, all cults are just really kind of boring when you get down to it. It's like we all rubberneck at the cult experience because it seems so different, right? And again, there's that whole trauma porn aspect to it, which is what I was reacting to from this journalist's writing. But at the end of the day, again, it is all just the same playbook with different variations on a theme, and I guess at some point I wish that we'd all get to that point of like, this is fucking boring. Let's stop feeding the frenzy of, on one hand, I appreciate all the documentaries and the podcasts and everything that are educating people. But what I don't love is the trauma is entertainment part of it,
Exactly.
And if we could get to a point where we're like, it's boring. Now let's study it from an academic perspective. I know that not everybody is going to nerd out like you and me about it, but I think that it would become less exploitative because I've had producers call me wanting to hear my story, which we still are sort of circumventing here, talking about other stuff. But it is a very kind of exploitative experience, I'm happy to tell my story because I think that it helps other people like me. But it doesn't really help the person that's never experienced trafficking, domestic violence, coercive control.
That's right.
And I tell my story a lot on social media or pieces of it because those are the people that I've connected to. People who maybe have not had a cult experience, but came out of an incredibly abusive relationship, which, some of us will call a one-on-one cult. They find catharsis in like, oh man, I resonate with these things. Or I have a friend who's the child of alcoholics. And she's like, I resonate so much with what you're saying about these things. That's why I tell my story, not to entertain people who are like, oh, look at what the weird cult does. Look at these sex rituals. Fuck that. No.
Exactly. I think in a way, that's one reason why I have been hesitant to continue doing a lot of interviews with former cult members is because I started feeling like I was massaging misery, and I don't want to do that. And as you said, really encapsulating it with exploitative. It's like there's just. What are we doing this for? And I work very hard to try to draw out and point out to people, the lessons to be learned, the takeaways that, please learn this so that it's not just something that happened to them very unfortunately, but so it doesn't happen to you or anybody you love,
Yeah. Yeah. The two podcasts where I really told my story in full, one was the Shunned podcast, which is really JW's telling their stories. But what I did with Michael Shemwell, who's the host, is I tried to use my experience as a lens into that again, we're speaking dialects of the same language. We are more alike than we are different. And then the other time was on the Falling Out podcast, which I mentioned before, which is really there might be people listening to it for the trauma porn aspect, but I think it's really directed towards other ex-Moonie SGAs who are in the healing process. And for many of us SGAs, hearing each other's stories does have catharsis. There is a healing aspect to it because we carry so much shame and stigma. But outside of those contexts, I'm very careful with my story. I talk to survivor advocates and healthcare professionals, usually mental health professionals, to use my story as an educational tool. Because, I've had plenty of experience of being the freak. I really don't want that for myself, and I don't want to perpetuate that for other people.
Exactly. I've gotten to the point now socially where I don't bring it up anymore. I used to because it was an interesting thing to talk about and because people were fascinated by it. And it was a way to connect, that kind of thing. I mean, that's how I sort of used it. Only because at first I wasn't sure what to say, and then you start talking to people, and I specifically connected with skeptic groups and kind of the atheist crowd, and they were fascinated by it. I mean, endlessly fascinated by it. So I found a willing audience, and it was cathartic at first to do that. But now I'm wary of it because I know how it can dominate conversation, how it can take over the room, how everybody gets all interested. And I don't like being the focus of attention anymore in social settings like that. I feel like I'm depriving other people of oxygen and stuff. It's weird. I don't like talking about it anymore. I think I've reached that tipping point. So, and I mean socially, not professionally here. But
right. Yeah. Also, what's a social setting? I don't know anymore.
Yeah. Right. There is that too. Yeah. Exactly. So I think what we're really saying is we're just trying to, how do we take these experiences and do something constructive with them so that we can, really benefit other people and not just be entertainment.
Yeah. I don't have an accurate answer to that question yet. I'm still in it. And I spoke with Phil Drysdale on his podcast, which is all about deconstruction of Christianity, about ethical consumption of these stories. And that's a hard one too, right? And I used the example of there's this idea of ethical porn and ethical fashion, right? And so how do we apply that to whatever we're consuming? And it is hard, right? Because it's certainly easier to just digest what we're given or search out whatever titillates us. And so I think that we're all guilty in that regard. And it takes a lot of effort and sometimes uncomfortable effort to figure out both sides of the equation, how to contribute in a way that doesn't harm yourself or others, and also how to ethically consume. And I don't have a good answer for either of those things. I'm just hoping to sort of learn as I go, Yeah,
exactly. I've globbed onto critical thinking as the theme, the path now. If a path is necessary, if guideposts are necessary in my life, and I believe they are, then here's the most objective, the most rational guidelines I can think of that are not the brainchild of some weirdo or egotist or narcissist, right?
Yeah, and I think for a lot of us SGAs, specifically multi-generational adults too, because I do want to acknowledge that there are some groups that have been around longer, and so you've got a lineage in them. Critical thinking is sort of the antithesis of how our brains were wired. Some of us don't, it's like we don't have the muscles for it, right? Because we were literally taught not to critically think. It was in the parlance of the Unification Church, it was creating a common base for Satan to invade and things like that.
There
Like
you go.
there's a lot of circular arguments and circular logic within the cultic framework. And so when you try to step outside of it, and have some sort of like Socratic method, or just even ask why, you get shamed and shunned. And so it does shut down, again, a lot of those pathways in you. And so for many of us, it's hard to do, and I find myself sometimes spinning my wheels with that, and it's very easy to revert to old thinking, because that is the soup that you were in for so long. My friend Lisa Kona, another SGA from the Unification Church, says that our brains were pickled and carved in this, and it's like such a perfect way of describing it. It's creepy, but it's true.
Yeah.
And so it is not for your listeners, and I'm sure that you've talked about this before, but it's not a simple thing for us to do this critical thinking. It's very uncomfortable. It's like these are atrophied muscles that we have to build up, and it's painful to do sometimes.
That's right. That's exactly right. And I have found for myself that everything you just said, and I have extended it further, because in looking at and educating about critical thinking as a topic, and going into logical fallacies and rhetoric and arguments and claims, and what is truth, and what is science, and what is the scientific method, and what is this all about? I mean, I've gone deep on this stuff just to try to get my own head straight about how should I think. And I have my claim, what I feel is true about this is that I don't think anybody is set up to organically, naturally be a good critical thinker. It's kind of like trying to imagine yourself being born as a black belt. There is nobody who's born a black belt. It's a discipline. And I put it that way, as I say, it's not just a skill set. It's not just some ideas. It's a discipline. You have to practice it. And it's only through repetition and practice that you get good, because it's not something our brains are tuned to do.
No. And I think that the more you study about like neurobiology, the more that you recognize that there is varying levels of activity in our brain, in various parts of our brains, depending on what we are engaging with and what we're not engaging with. And so therefore, critical thinking is going to be an area of our brain that's not lighting up much during the cult. And it is going to take time to get us there.
Yeah, exactly. Because because you got, if a normal person, if a normal person, I love this, the quote unquote, the normal person, the normies, right? Yeah. If your average Joe, whoever that is, can't organically, naturally, critically think, we've got, a whole other barrier as second gen members to deal with, which is this sort of mattress of nonsense that gets shoved, over us. And
it sounds so suffocating. Nonsense.
Exactly the point, right? It just, you can't see anything. You're just buried under this stuff, Okay, let me we're not going to redirect totally here, but this is just, I'm having so much fun in this conversation. What do you think has been, having been through everything you've been through, and we've covered, I think we've given enough little tidbits that people get the idea you've had a pretty abused life. And if there
I didn't think so. I didn't think so. Isn't that funny?
Well, neither did I, right? Until after the fact, right? I mean, I was in prison for 3 years, not prison, but the RPF.
Yes,
I mean,
right.
This kind of nonsense. And this is just this was our normal.
And it's so weird because like when I read Going Clear, for example, and I read about that, I'm like, well, my experience obviously wasn't that abusive because I didn't go through that. Right.
Right.
And I also, I'm always like, caveat, don't compare pain, right? Don't compare trauma. That's super unhelpful for us. But yeah, it is so interesting that we all normalize our experiences. And so going back to a prior question of yours, like even as I was reading Evan Stark's book, Coercive Control, How Men Trap Women in Personal Life, which is such a dense read. It's like, it's such important information and it's so hard to get through because his sentences are like entire paragraphs. But reading that and then, going through some of the section on domestic violence, I'm like, oh, I grew up in a really violent home, because I did. There was a lot of violence in my home. And then I didn't know what labor trafficking was until my friend Teddy Hose, who's an activist in the ex-Mooney SGA world, described it to me, and like with examples. And I was like, oh, holy shit. And then again, like going through this master's program and reading about these laws and reading about these case studies, I'm like, yeah, that checks out. And so I think that, again, as we educate ourselves, like it really puts our stories into better context. But if you had asked me 2 years ago if I'd grown up in an abusive home, I would have been like, yeah, my dad like yelled sometimes and hit us with a belt. But like, actually, no, there was really, really intense violence. To the point where I remember my mom telling me at 8 years old not to tell my teachers what was going on because she thought Child Protective Services was going to come in. And that was a threat throughout my entire life.
Yeah.
To the point where I didn't even go to therapy until my youngest brother was 18 because I was so afraid of my 4 younger siblings getting taken away and put into foster care. Wow. Because that had been ingrained. Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot there. And, to sort of like tie the story in a bow, I left the Unification Church at 21, and leaving is more of like I distanced myself over time, but there was a specific break where I ended a forced arranged marriage in the Unification Church to a stranger. And I couldn't even use the term forced for the longest time because I didn't have the education to understand that I had grown up in that coercive control milieu, that it was in Dr. Janja Lalich's parlance, bounded choice, right? You either marry this person or you jump off a fucking cliff because you're basically dead to us, right? You'll lose your family. You'll lose your financial. I was working for the church at the time. You'll lose all of your friends. Even as I struggled, I got fired from my church job. I lost all my friends because I wasn't like putting on a happy face all the time.
Yeah.
But it took me a long time to use the word cult. I wasn't comfortable with that word because I'd been indoctrinated into, we're not a cult. Cult is a bad word. And, Scientology is our friend. In fact, I told you on Twitter, the Unification Church, when I worked for it, for $100 a month, sleeping on a floor full of other women. I don't know why I did women. I was going to say volunteers. If that's not, modern slavery.
Yes, exactly.
But Scientology rented the second floor of this building, right? So there was like a lot of palling around with Scientology. But at the same time, I told you, this one girl that I knew who was in the building with me was like, don't go to the second floor. They'll try to brainwash you there. And I thought brainwashing meant you got tied to a chair and had somebody like play videos for you all day until you were just like this mind melted zombie, which is probably what, the massive public thinks brainwashing is too. And you turn into the Manchurian Candidate.
Right.
But I think that overall, the point that I'm trying to make to really thread the needle here is that education has helped me understand my story better and to put it into context more. And that has been so healing for me. So talking to cult aware professionals, this educational program, et cetera, even though I've been out 15 years, I'm finding like it's so healing to realize that there's a new depth to my own experience and story that I'm understanding and I'm contextualizing and finding forgiveness for myself too, because I think a lot of SGAs and MGAs, we will judge ourselves. We'll take the stigma that society projects onto us and just like amplify it.
Yep.
Because we don't understand that we grew up in an environment with such intense coercion that I believed for the longest time that because I broke down after days of begging to leave a locked building, a moon mansion on an 18-acre compound, I had no cell phone, no money, et cetera, right? And I was 2 hours away from home, begged for days to leave, and then finally broke down and was married to a stranger. I believed that I'd chosen it because my family, the church, told me, you chose this. But that's not really the definition of choice. So again, all of this coming back into the neat little package of, I think education is super healing. It's helpful for those outside to understand, but I think it's really helpful for us to kind of own our stories in a way that is a lot more truthful and doesn't carry the propaganda and the shame of the cultic experience with us.
I could not agree more. I think that, well, for the longest time, I mean, only until, I guess, this year, I mean, there were a couple of stabs I took at getting some therapy up until this year. And I've been out since 2012. Right. So 2013, I guess you could say officially. But education was my therapy. was really important. I mean, psychoeducation is a component of cult recovery, but I think you can overplay it, but I don't think you can overstress it, and that's why I talk about it all the time.
Yeah, I first went to therapy in 2012, partially because I didn't realize that I needed therapy. So I'd been out 6 years at that point. Moon died in 2012 and my youngest brother turned 18. And so it was sort of this like conflagration of things. And I was like, I need help. And most therapists don't really understand the cultic experience. And I didn't have an education to educate my therapist at the time. So we didn't really get very far and it compounded some issues for me. But so my journey into education was after my mother passed, I had no real connection to who my parents were prior to the church. And I had very little connection to my ancestry, if you will. You know, we weren't really allowed to be close to our extended family. So I became fascinated with this idea of like, what was that conversion experience? Because I couldn't figure out who my parents were. There was no way to access that information because too many people had died to be able to tell me this is who your mother was, this is who your father was. So I started reading all these first gen memoirs. And that led me slowly but surely into the more academic world. And Josh Freed's book, Moonwebs, part one is him trying to rescue his friend Benj from the Unification Church. And part two is all psychoeducation. So he interviewed Margaret Singer. He is referring to Lifton. And so all of those footnotes became like my library, you know, and it was so important to me. And then I actually ended up meeting my therapist through a recovery group that ICSA put on. And I do a lot of my own reading because the ICSA has such a library of studies that I feel like those two things in tandem are really helpful for me personally. I know that doesn't work for everybody and not everybody is a research nerd, but I eat that up. You know, it's so helpful to me to realize people are interested, people are studying this, and there are things that help me understand myself a little bit better in black and white.
Exactly. I have found it to be immensely clarifying across a number of spheres or areas of my life. Yeah. From my thinking to how I interrelate with other people to, you know, taking apart or sort of shedding a lot of the false information and propaganda and nonsense from the cult or, you know, from Hubbard. Just so much to do, so many filters to take apart. I mean, it's like the analogy, the onion layers, surely you've heard that, you know.
Yeah.
Comes off like onion layers, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder.
Every layer you take off, you cry.
Yeah. I'd never heard that one.
No,
that's funny. I like that. I like it when I hear something new like that. Yes, that's why I tell you that's actually exactly how it works. So that's funny.
Yes, it is. Yep.
Interesting. Well, do you have any standout? I mean, has there been anything, and it's okay if not, I'm just kind of wondering, has there been anything that stood out for you in your education that was particularly a milestone or, you know, even to this day, you're like, that was so important for me to understand for clarifying my experience?
Well, again, you know, Josh Fried's book, it wasn't my experience, but it was a big light bulb moment for me when he starts talking about the indoctrination process that is so basically, lifted right out of the Chinese and North Korean thought reform programs. Being able to sort of trace the genesis of that made me understand my history a little bit better. And this is such a touchy topic for a lot of SGAs, balancing the compassion for the parent who is tricked and manipulated, and then also trying to hold them accountable for the abuse that they perpetuated. It's a very uncomfortable place to be, because there's a lot of us go back and forth between it. And there's I don't know if there's a comfortable middle ground, because both of these things are true. My parents inflicted horrible abuse, as did many other first generation. And they are many times, even after they leave, unable to acknowledge it, because that means that there's so much work that they have to do. Many people who leave, there's like two different kinds of first gen. There's the one, at least from my experience, there are the ones that are totally bitter. And then there are the ones that are like, they still believe in Moon, or they still believe in the church, but they believe that the church has become corrupt. And I don't like either of them. I really struggle with first generation, which is hard, because like there are so many amazing academics in ICSA who are first generation in different groups. I just don't want to deal with the Mooney ones. And at the same time, like I totally respect the work that Steve Hassan does too. So
Sure.
I'm dealing with my own shit with that. But yeah, I think that understanding from Josh Fried's work led me to some other really important books, like Escaping Utopia, which you and I talked about pre-interview, by Dr. Jan Jelalich and Kara McLaren. One of the problems that I faced reading that book is remnant black and white thinking on my part, because there are no Unification Church second gen that are interviewed. So I didn't see my exact experience in it. And it was easy for me to be like, well, but really like digesting it post reading it, it came back to that, like, oh, variations on a theme. We are all very similar. So that's a really important milestone book for me. And it's one that I recommend to everybody.
Excellent. Excellent. I want to highlight for second gen members listening, for people out there listening, wondering about this, hearing us talk about this, because you've been out for years, I've been out for years. We have done a lot of work. You and I have invested a lot of time, clearly,
and money, clearly.
Yeah, and money. That's right. And in trying to figure this out. I mean, you really have this question of what the hell happened to me, and varying, and people are going to accept varying levels of answer to that question, I think. But I don't know anybody coming out of these situations who isn't asking that question, like, what the hell happened to me, and how do I prevent that maybe from happening again? Right?
Again, it took me a really long time, probably 6 years, and Moon dying, before I was ready to ask that question.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to share this to acknowledge other people who've been through this.
Mm-hmm.
I was in survival mode. Like, I need to keep a roof over my head and feed myself for a long time, because it was fraught. And again, not to compare pain, I know people who went through worse, who were living in their cars and dumpster diving and, living in shelters and kinds of things. And I was a hair's breadth away from that as well. And so, because there are no services designed for SGAs who are leaving these high control groups, it's okay if you're not on that part of like Maslow's pyramid to be asking those questions. It's okay if you are still in the like food, shelter kind of part of the bottom of the period, like that pyramid, that's legit. And that is I just want to draw attention to that, something that so many of us go through. So if you're like, what's wrong with me because I'm not asking the question of what happened to me, there's nothing wrong with you.
Oh God, no. Oh God, no. And
I wasn't trying to imply that you were saying that. I know how I processed that at that time.
Yeah.
So
No, I thank you. Thank you for clarifying that, because because I speak from my own experience, of course, and I don't want to project me onto everybody else. And where I was trying to go there was to say, for you, it was Moonwebs. For me, it was Demon Haunted World by Carl Sagan. For others, it'll be another thing. It doesn't have to be a single thing that's going to be your epiphany moment or are going to cause you to have, that's going to be your milestones. I recommend Demon Haunted World because it was such a big deal for me. Maybe it'll be a big deal for other people. Maybe it won't. I've found varying, your experience may vary. But
mileage may vary.
Yeah, exactly. But I believe that there is something for all of us. I think that all of us can find the book, the knowledge, the information, the video, the whatever. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be one thing. For some of us, it's a number of things. We have lots of questions or lots of layers to the questions or whatever it is that's going to hit us. But what I wanted to stress is, don't go on the quest, go look, see what's out there for you, see what resources are out there for you. You've mentioned the ICSA website has a wealth of resources. There's books, there's Google, there's this, there's that, there's podcasts, there's a million things out there, and anybody who's listening to this has already found this much. But I just wanted to stress that everybody's experience is very context specific. It's not a matter of here's the thing. When you're in a cult, you're on a production line, you're on an assembly line. Everybody's treated the same. And when you come out, you get to be you. You get to be different. And what's going to fit you might not necessarily what's going to fit me, but something will. And I guess I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I do say there's no like homogenous experience. So when you talk about the assembly line, we were all trying to fit into that. Yeah. But even our cult experiences were so different because we were all such different people and we were coming from various walks of life. And so, even to your point, there may not be an epiphany moment. You may not have this aha. It may be more of a long slog and you'll look back and be like, oh, damn, look at how far I've come without the light bulb going off necessarily. And I think that's valid too.
Fair enough. Absolutely. Absolutely. I could say your experiences may vary. But I think doing the work is fun. And I think it's important. I think it's valuable to do. And it seems again for second gen, it might be, I always feel a little cautious about this. You know what I mean? It falls under the umbrella of comparing trauma or something, maybe, I don't know. But I really want to stress that for second gens, who never had any other idea than the cult world that was presented to them. I really think that there's that added layer of work that needs to be done there. That the first gens don't necessarily have to experience, Well,
there's so much in that phrase, right? One of the things so I blog and I've taken some time off since the summer. But one of the things that I really stress when I cite research is that there's a dearth of research about the second gen, multi-gen experience. So a lot of the research that is there is talking about the pre-cult identity and then the recovery, right? And people who've grown up in these groups don't have the pre-cult identity to return to. And so it's going to be long and complicated, the work. And when you say the work to a cult kid, they're like, I gotta work.
Right.
And so one of the things that my therapist stresses to me is like, you should play. You didn't learn to play. That was something that was not allowed in your childhood. And so I sometimes approach the work like a good little cult kid, and that's something that I have to be careful of. It's part of why I've taken a break from my blog. I mean, now I'm in a master's program where it's like probably more intense. So I acknowledge that. But, I just, I want to stress balance too, that if the work is fun for you, if it feels cathartic, if it feels uplifting, if it's helpful, go for it. And if all you need to do is like parkour for a little while, like do it, do whatever lights you up, explore, because that's valuable too.
Exactly. What do you think should be done about the cult problem?
How do we solve world peace?
Yeah, exactly, right?
It's such a complicated question, right?
Yes.
Because I know that not all cults are religious, right? There's business cults, and there's personal familial cults, and there are political. Yours and my experience is the religious one, and so that's kind of what I can glom onto a little more readily. Is I think that we really have to look at, from a legal perspective, what is personal liberty, right? Because in the United States, religion is so protected. And even a question that our program facilitators brought up in a lecture on Wednesday was, in terms of the laws around gangs, the language of the law is, and I'm paraphrasing, is around like, if something doesn't align with British values of like democracy, et cetera, but what are British values? Like, how do you define them? And who gets to define them? And so in the United States, defining the breadth of religious liberty to the point that it infringes on personal liberty, and it is allowed to coerce people into situations that they wouldn't otherwise get into, like, that's problematic. And I think that there are some, to steal a phrase that might be totally inappropriate, some sacred cows in the United States that we do have to look at, that we have been unwilling to look at for a long time. And the Unification Church, this is part of why they have cozied up to a lot of these right-wing religious movements, because they are so protected from any kind of litigation, because they are hiding behind the facade of religion. Yep. And so I think we have to deconstruct this idea of like, what is this like a legitimate religion? And then, of course, we're going to get back into the cult wars with the new religious movements being like, this is a baby religion, we have to protect it.
Yep.
But is the Unification Church really a religion? Because we need to look at it from a financial perspective, right? The New York Times recently did an expose on the sushi industry. The Unification Church controls the majority of the sushi industry in the United States. And there were two lines in there, the subtext of which, and this was a super long article, but the two lines were about how the international marriages within the Unification Church allowed for Moon to import Japanese members into the United States and have them stay with legitimate visas or green cards eventually, and that many of these members worked for little to no pay, living in communal environments. Okay, so we're talking about human trafficking,
yes,
modern slavery right there. And the New York Times didn't call that out, right? And Steve Hassan made a really brilliant tweet about the fact that, like, okay, this is a great article, but you didn't cover the fact that this is an empire built on the backs of human trafficking, among other things. And I was really grateful for that, because he is such a strong voice in this realm. But I think that we have to be willing to have these conversations. Steve Hassan also, on the Freedom of Mind website, has a 71-page document of all of the business entities and front groups of the Unification Church. What religion needs 71 different business associations? And in her book, In the Shadow of the Moon, Nansa Kong, who is the former daughter-in-law of River Moon, talks about how people brought money into the United States from Japan, cash, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars in their purses, or people would like line their pants, underneath their pants, with this money. The government knew. People have known that money has been laundered by the Unification Church for a long time. But in John Gorenfeld's brilliant book, Bad Moon Rising, he tracks how the Unification Church has been cozying up with right-wing groups and started the Washington Times, which was also funded by human trafficking. So we have this really complex web that there's been this unwillingness to begin to untie.
Yep.
And again, I'm using the Unification Church as an example because that's the entity that I know the best. They've been hiding behind the fact that they're a religion for so many decades. But we have to start asking these questions, like, should they be protected like this? Because there is human liberty at stake, plus a lot of laws that are being broken. And I'm not necessarily saying that it's going to be easy, because again, we go back to that question of like conservatorships and personal liberty and what is choice. But if we start thinking about consent laws and coercive control laws and what are those going to look like, then maybe we'll have a foundation to start litigating against these entities that are so exploitative.
Exactly.
So I don't know if that's a solution, but that's just what I sort of chew on when I get angry.
You and me both. And in fact, that's what's led me to trying to figure out, okay, I can't save the world anymore. That's not my task, right? It's not
Wasn't that a carryover from the cult brain anyway? We were all supposed to save the world.
Well, that's the point, right? Is exactly that. And for a long time, that was a struggle, embarrassingly so, because it is such a silly notion. And yet, when it drives your thinking for decades, it's not something you just turn off like a light switch. And it took me a number of years to get past that. So now it's a joke and it's cool. And it's like, okay, good. Well, I'm not saving the world, but I would like to do something useful. I'd like to leave some sort of mark that matters. And I think that everything you just said is 100% true. And I could easily line up Scientology on that exact same description, right? Same model. Importing people, pages. If I showed you the list of all the front groups of Scientology, it goes on for pages. You know, the billions of dollars, the money laundering, the fact that it's really just, you know, using religious cloaking to hide a business model. It's not a religion at all. You know, this kind of stuff. And what I realized is that, you know, these folks in academia have been buttressing the cult's arguments for so long now that they're institutionalized, and that this is why I'm targeting academia as something that I think I can do something about, and that it needs to be done, because it's not just the hallowed halls of academia, or, you know, you go to college and you're going to get some wrong data. That's not the point about academia. The point is that they are the expert witnesses in the courtrooms.
Yeah.
So when you try to take the Unification Church or Scientology to court, there they are, telling the judge how they're a legitimate, credible religious organization, and these apostates are just telling horror stories, and it's all just nonsense.
Yeah, there's a book that it's Brainwashed The History of Mind Control by Dominic Streetfield, and I might be butchering his name, but I'm mad at him anyway, so it doesn't matter. There's a whole section on brainwashing in the Unification Church, and I read it on Instagram, IGTV, which is no longer a thing. But if you go to my IG profile, you can find the videos. And as I'm reading, I'm sort of like talking about the points that he made. And like in the beginning, he's talking about how horrible the indoctrination is, but then also how toxic deprogramming is. But then he very much goes into like the new religious movement line of thinking. And he talks about how, like, well, Dr. Margaret Singer can't be trusted because this one thing, which sounded kind of like cult propaganda. And I was like, what? And now I want to like grab the book and find it to be like, this doesn't make any sense. But the point is that he's a journalist, right? So he's not an academic, but he was editorializing based on data that he got from new religious movement scholars, and was discrediting one of the foremost minds in cult research, who spent 50 years studying cults and interviewing people, who has a doctorate in like psychology or psychiatry. Like, she knows her shit. She's dead now, unfortunately. She knew her shit. And so just to write her off in this footnote like that, I was like, wow, like these people have done quite a number on the thinking and the writing that is coming out about these groups, to the point where in the beginning of this chapter, it sounded like he was criticizing the Unification Church. And by the end, he's like, I don't know, this person seems totally normal. And it sounds like, just a lot of scare tactics by the psychologists and the anti-cultists. And it was so weird because that bait and switch happens without you even realizing it, but if that's where you're getting your information from, it's still propaganda.
Exactly.
That is still propagandized,
Exactly.
So yeah.
It reaches into lots of different strange nooks and crannies that you just wouldn't imagine it would reach. And yes, popular media, journalists who take themselves seriously and go look and read and listen to, people who they believe, because these people have letters after their name and have spent a number of years in the hallowed halls of academia. These people are the authorities. They're the ones I should listen to. And unfortunately, they might as well just go to the Unification Church or the Church of Scientology and say, give me your propaganda and I'll go regurgitate it for you. And that's
basically what the book Making a Moonie felt like to me.
Yes.
I know that a lot of inroads have been made in terms of trying to have dialogue between these two sides, but that book is like a big wound for me, right? Because the thesis of the book is that they do nothing wrong, and there's no abuses and there's no thought reform. And I'm like, did you just like make my entire story and all of my trauma illegitimate?
Exactly.
And the Unification Church paid for this research to happen. So yeah, I completely agree. And that book's on my shelf, and every time I look at it, I'm like,
yep.
Okay.
Yep. Well, there's a book by Donald Westbrook called Among the Scientologists.
Yeah.
Just published within the last 10 years, which is the latest and greatest monograph, and shows that the research on Scientology is moving forward at great speed. And isn't this wonderful? And it's nothing but a con job by Scientology, who feeds this guy, pre-drilled, pre-coached, scripted Scientologists going and sitting in front of him, and anyway, we know how nonsensical this is. It's the struggle is the fact that these guys have millions of dollars behind them, billions, and and us poor schleps got nothing. Nobody's backing us. Nobody's doing the work on the other side because there's no money in this.
Right.
So,
I mean, 2 points to beat a dead horse to continue. Cult Awareness Network, which is the primogenitor of ICSA, is now run by the Scientologists because they sued. And I think that Cult Awareness Network basically became bankrupt to the point where Scientologists were able to get the name and the domain. Yep. So if you go to the Cult Awareness Network looking for help, looking to get somebody out, you are in direct contact with Scientology.
Exactly.
So there's that. And then I don't know if Scientology has a similar model, but the Unification Church in the past and still today, and this has been a sort of evolving thing, they would put on these conferences all over the world, and they would pay for people to come to these conferences, and they would sound really legit, like the International Interreligious Federation for this, that, and the other thing, right? And they would have,
I have in front of me right now the Journal for the Critical Study of Religion, published in collaboration with the Religious Studies Project. This is 2020. And this journal is nothing but cult apologia, bought and paid for by the cults.
Yeah. And the way that happens is these conferences where like these academics are on the cult's dime being indoctrinated and groomed. Same way that, guys, if you didn't know this, Reverend Moon got crowned in 2004 in a building in Congress by Congress members. Why? Because of money. This is the opening scene in John Gorenfeld's book, Bad Moon Rising. If you look it up, there's an old Salon article. If you look up Reverend Moon crowned Congress, like it happened. I was on the cusp of being out. Like this was right around the time that I was forced into the arranged marriage. I was already having issues, and that's why they forced me into the marriage. But even I couldn't believe it. I was like, what's going on? This is weird. And at the time, Moon was proclaiming that like even Hitler had been redeemed through his ideology, and Stalin, and they'd all been blessed and blah, blah, blah. And so our elected leaders crowned Reverend Moon. And then, of course, afterwards, they're like, oh, we had no idea this was happening. But the point is that through money and through connections developed over time via money, these groups are able to work their way into academia, to politics, et cetera. And it's a huge problem. And it goes back to my point before of like, where are we letting these groups get off where they shouldn't be allowed to, right. And also like, are you doing your due diligence? If someone's paying for you to go to a conference in Hawaii, are you Googling who's putting this on? Because like, I'm pretty sure that Steve Hassan has this organization in one of his lists that you should be aware of, so just like one Google search could tell you. Granted, some of this happened in the 70s and 80s pre-Google, but the point is that this is still happening today. So the Unification Church had Trump speak at one of their events. They had Pence speak at one of their events. These guys know who the Moonies are, but because of money, they're getting seemingly legit. I don't even want to say legit because like I can't stand those guys, but for a subsection of the American population, this is a legitimizer. And so there are people in positions of power who are being seduced and are lending legitimacy to these groups, and it's a huge problem, and I could just bitch about that all day, but yeah. I think it's something that we all need to be aware of.
Well, for sure. And if you, and I'm on the, again, totally on the same boat here. If you watch documentaries on Netflix, like The Family, Jeff Charlotte's book turned into documentary by Alex Gibney, or Going Clear, or any countless number of these things, you will find in these documentaries specifically the government tie-in. Mm-hmm. The National Prayer Breakfast is nothing but Christian cultic activity gone crazy. The entire government signed on with that.
Yeah, Parents' Day is I don't know if it's like necessarily a national holiday, but it's something we recognize in the United States. That's a holy day in the Unification Church.
There
You're
you
welcome.
Go. Right, exactly. Next, we're going to have L. Ron Hubbard's birthday being nationally recognized. I mean, this kind of thing, right? And so the point being that we have a cult problem here, and the cult problem is not one cult; it's a number of cults that all have this problem, and that problem is they exert an undue influence on politicians.
And Dr. Steve Hassan has also pointed out, too, that these groups, they team up with each other. They support each other because what's good for one group is good for another. So if, one group is suing another group, people like us, if Scientology is suing you, the Unification Church is going to support that.
That's right.
And so that's something that, we're all working against, is these like multi-billion-dollar organizations that are protected and have a lot of good connections. And then there's people like you and me on the other side of this. But I was going to say something else, and now it's completely gone.
Oh, it'll come back. It'll come back. I know we're ranting a little bit here, but I actually wanted to ask you. Well, I did ask you before, and I think this entire conversation, in a way, has been the answer, which is, how has your education influenced your post-cult experience? And you and I are on exactly the same page on so many things. I think exactly because you have gone so far in reading and looking and listening and finding out what this is all about, as I have, and we are both trying to engage in some kind of public education campaign.
Yeah, I think for me, that is one of the most important things, is like, I look back on my old self, and if somebody asked a question that was projecting shame or stigma onto me, I would shut down. And I'm at a point now where I don't necessarily want to like go against the group, and fight the Goliath, right? But if somebody says something that I I see that shame and stigma in, I want to step in to shield people who are not at a point yet where they're ready to have those conversations. And I want to give those people those tools because they were so lacking for me. And I remembered the point I was going to make before. One of the educational pieces that I kind of bang on about is that people who remember the Moonies either now think of them as sort of like this like friendly group, or they think that they just disappeared, when in fact many of these groups go underground or they reinvent themselves. So they're not called the Unification Church anymore. They're called the Family Federation for World Peace or something else, you know? And so it is really important to educate people about the extent of cultic manipulation and the fact that they are still here. They haven't gone anywhere. They've just evolved. And that is one of the things that's so hard about these groups. When you're on the inside, it's the new Providence or it's the new directive or whatever. But that's part of the cult evolution, to escape the stigma that the public have finally recognized needs to be put on the group, so that they can continue their activities just under a different name or a different umbrella, or to protect themselves with various shell organizations. So my mission is kind of twofold. It's like, I want to protect the kids like me who are still trying to figure their shit out, who are not ready to have those conversations because it's still so raw for them, or they haven't had the opportunity to do the reading or develop those critical thinking skills. I'll be like, well, actually, Dr. Margaret Singer says XYZ because I have the ability to pull that out now. And it comes to me more readily, whereas a few years ago, it didn't. And also just kind of banging on about the fact that like these groups are still present. Every time you eat sushi, you're supporting the Unification Church kind of thing. And that they're influencing your politics. You know, the Washington Times is a precursor to OAN, I think, and some of these other
Newsmax, Breitbart, Daily Stormer. Need we go on?
They quote the Washington Times.
Yes.
Reagan lent legitimacy to the Washington Times, which was a propaganda machine for the Unification Church and for the right and now the alt-right. And so it's so important to realize that part of why we're here is because these groups have infiltrated so many aspects of American life. So you could say that, you know, the Unification Church might be partially responsible for the fact that Trump got elected or for the riots of January 6th. That might seem like hyperbole, but again, you know, to promote John Gorenfeld's book, if you read Bad Moon Rising, he talks about the influence campaigns that went on since the 1970s until he published the book in 2004. Which culminates in Moon being crowned by our senators. And so I think that it is really important for us to realize that to use Dr. Margaret Singer's, you know, book title, there are cults in our midst. And there's a lot going on behind the scenes that we're not aware of. And so we have to sort of strip back that curtain to be able to see the machinations.
Big time. Big time. Well, I think that was brilliantly stated, actually.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, well done. Well, anytime you can get the word machinations out loud into a sentence, you're doing good.
Right, without like mushing it in your mouth.
That's right, exactly. Well, this has been fascinating. I'm gonna move toward wrapping this up, only because we've been at it for 2 hours, and we've had a very wide-ranging conversation, far more than I imagined that we would, and I figured this was going to be pretty good. So.
And neither of us are drinking either, but we're still having a great time. Exactly.
Wait till we do that show. So I actually am leaving this open if in the future we want to do this again. I think that would be, I think there's a wealth of things that we can discuss here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because this is a real super important topic. And I don't think there is such a thing as talking about this too much, given the fact that of what you just said. Yeah.
You know, it doesn't go away. It hasn't gone away.
No. And we can bury heads in the sands and we can deny, and people do that because that's what they tend to do. But that's why we got to keep putting it there.
Yeah.
You know, because this isn't a fad. This is a thing. This is real.
Yeah. And I think that it's important to recognize too that in times of social unrest, cults are at their most appealing to people, you know, and so that's why there was this huge surge of them in the 1970s. And that's why we have things like QAnon now, and you can debate whether or not you want to call it a cult, but I think that the point is that conspiracy thinking and all of the things that sort of are under that larger cultic umbrella, they develop in the environment that we're in now. And so it's that much more important to be aware of what's happening, to be aware of the playbook, to have those critical thinking skills in place.
Exactly. Well, I couldn't have put it better myself, so I won't even try. Thank you very much for being part of my show this week.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, really enjoyed this.
Me too. I love to nerd out with people about this kind of stuff.
Exactly. All right, folks. Well, I hope you all nerded out with us, and I hope this was, as I like to say, entertaining, informative, and educational. Those are the three things I'm trying to do with my channel here, and I hope I'm succeeding. And if I am, consider throwing some support my way. I would really appreciate it. And that all being said, I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.